Let me start with something that almost no one talks about openly, even though it happens in quiet moments every single day in the lives of more people than you would ever expect. Some people apologize for existing. Not in those exact words, never in those exact words, but in 100 small, barely visible ways that have become so habitual, so deeply woven into the fabric of how they move through the world, that the word sorry is no longer really a word at all. It has become a reflex, a social tic, a way of softening their presence before anyone has had the chance to object to it. They apologize before asking a question, as if the question itself is an imposition. They apologize for an opinion the moment they sense it might not be shared. They apologize for crying, for laughing too loudly, for needing something, for running a few minutes early to a plan, for the weather, for taking up a seat that was clearly empty and available. And most of the time, they don't even register that they've done it, because it happens so automatically, so far below the level of conscious thought, that the apology is already in the air before the mind has had any chance to ask, did I actually do anything wrong here?
From the outside, this pattern can look like politeness. It can look like consideration, or humility, or the kind of gentle social awareness that makes someone easy and pleasant to be around. People sometimes even compliment it. You're so thoughtful, so careful, so easy. And the person receiving that compliment smiles and says thank you without ever mentioning what it actually costs them to move through the world this way. Because from the inside, chronic apologizing doesn't feel like grace. It feels like bracing. It feels like walking through every room, every conversation, every new relationship with your shoulders slightly raised and your breath slightly held, perpetually waiting for the moment you do something wrong, and apologizing in advance, quietly, reflexively, so that when that moment comes, the damage might be a little smaller, the reaction a little less severe, the withdrawal a little less complete. That is not humility. That is vigilance, dressed in polite language. And it is exhausting in a way that most people carrying it have never been given the words to describe.
People who apologize for things that clearly aren't their fault are often misread as insecure or anxious, or simply lacking in confidence. But the truth is usually far older than that, far more rooted, and far more human than most people realize. Because chronic apologizing is almost never really about the present moment. It is not really about the situation in front of them, or the person standing across from them, or the specific words that were just exchanged. It is about the past. It is a strategy, a very old, very practiced, very automatic strategy that was built in an environment where things went wrong regularly, and where the child, inexplicably and unfairly, came to believe that the wrongness was somehow their doing, or worse, was directly told that it was. Most people who over-apologize didn't develop this pattern in their adult life. They developed it in childhood, in homes where the emotional atmosphere was unpredictable, where a parent's mood could shift without any visible cause, where love felt conditional in ways that were never explicitly stated but were somehow always understood, where approval was available when the child was good and compliant and undemanding, and quietly withdrawn when they were not. In those environments, a child learned something that no child should ever have to learn. They learn to scan. They scan the room before they enter it. They read faces before they speak. They measure the emotional temperature of every space with an accuracy that most adults never develop, and they adjust themselves accordingly, making themselves smaller here, more agreeable there, quieter in this moment, more helpful in that one, all in service of one single goal, which is to keep the peace. And when something goes wrong anyway, when the atmosphere shifts despite all their careful calibrating, the child's first instinct is not to wonder what happened, it is to wonder what they did. Because somewhere along the way, they learned that assuming responsibility, even false responsibility,
even responsibility for things entirely outside their control, gave them something precious. It gave them the illusion of agency. If it is my fault, then I can fix it. If I can fix it, then I am not helpless. And if I am not helpless, then I am safe. Psychologically, this is called self-blame as a regulatory strategy, and it is not weakness. It is a child's intelligent, resourceful, heartbreaking attempt to create some sense of order in an environment that had very little.
One of the deepest psychological roots of chronic apologizing is something called the fawn response, and it is one of the most important things to understand if this pattern feels familiar to you. Most people know about fight, flight, and freeze as the body's primary responses to threat or danger, but there is a fourth response that receives far less attention, and it may be the most socially invisible of all of them. Fawning is what happens when a person, usually a child in the context where this response is first learned, discovers that the safest way to navigate conflict is not to fight it, not to flee from it, and not to freeze in the face of it, but to immediately and completely appease the person causing it, to become agreeable, to become accommodating, to become, in whatever way is necessary, exactly what the other person needs them to be in order for the tension to pass and the danger to recede. Sorry, you're right, it was my fault. I should have known better. I didn't mean to upset you. These phrases become tools, not expressions of genuine remorse, but instruments of de-escalation. And the critical thing to understand is that they work. In the short term, in the environment where they were first learned, they work beautifully. The tension passes, the person calms down, the danger goes away, the child is safe, and the nervous system, which is always learning, always updating, always building its model of what the world requires, files that experience away with a simple and devastating conclusion. Apologizing works. Do it again next time. Do it faster next time. Do it before you even need to next time. Over time, this becomes so deeply automatic that the apology arrives before the assessment. Before the person has even had a moment to pause and ask themselves whether they actually did anything wrong, the sorry is already forming in their throat, already softening their posture, already reshaping their expression into something that communicates, "I defer to you, I take responsibility, please don't be upset with me." And this creates something quietly devastating that goes far beyond the surface inconvenience of apologizing too much. Because a person who apologizes reflexively, without assessment, gradually loses access to their own sense of reality. They lose the ability to accurately perceive what is their responsibility and what belongs to someone else. They absorb blame that was never theirs to carry. They accept versions of events in which they are always at least partially wrong, always at least partially at fault, always at least partially the reason things went the way they did. Not because that reflects the truth, but because their nervous system has been trained to orient towards self-blame as its default position. Psychologists call this a loss of self-boundary, and it is one of the loneliest experiences a person can have because they are surrounded by relationships, surrounded by other people, and yet completely disconnected from their own interior sense of what is real and what is fair and what they actually deserve. There is also something called chronic guilt as a baseline emotional state, and it is worth understanding because it explains so much about why this pattern is so persistent and so difficult to shift. For most people, guilt functions as a signal. It arises in response to something specific, something done or left undone, and it passes once the situation has been acknowledged or addressed. But for people who over-apologize, guilt is not a signal. It is a weather system. It is something that exists as a kind of constant ambient hum beneath the surface of everyday life, a low-grade, ever-present sense that they are always slightly too much, slightly in the way, slightly taking up more than their rightful share of space, time, attention, and goodwill. They cannot necessarily point to a specific cause. There's no particular incident responsible for it. It is simply the atmosphere they inhabit, the emotional climate they have lived in for so long that they no longer notice it as unusual. And the apologies are their way of releasing pressure from that atmosphere, just enough, just regularly enough to keep functioning inside it.
Here is something about people who over-apologize that rarely gets acknowledged and that deserves to be named clearly. Many of them are extraordinarily attuned to other people's emotions, genuinely, remarkably sensitive to the emotional texture of every interaction they're part of. They notice discomfort before it has been expressed. They feel the shift in a conversation's energy before any words have changed. They're aware of what other people need, what other people feel, what other people are carrying, with an accuracy and a tenderness that most people never develop. And this is not a flaw. This is a genuinely beautiful quality, the kind of emotional attunement that makes someone a deeply caring friend, a thoughtful partner, a present and perceptive human being.
But it has a shadow side that is important to understand, because when you are that attuned to the emotional temperature of other people, you also feel responsible for every fluctuation in that temperature that you detect. Someone seems quiet. Did I do something? Someone seems distracted. Are they upset with me? Someone takes a little longer than usual to respond. Have I said something wrong? And the apology follows, not because anything actually happened, not because there is any real evidence of wrongdoing, but because something might have happened. And in the internal logic of this pattern, it is always safer to apologize preemptively than to risk being the unacknowledged cause of someone else's pain. There is a particular kind of relationship dynamic that people who over-apologize tend to find themselves in, sometimes repeatedly, and it is worth naming honestly, because recognizing it is often the beginning of something important. People who apologize reflexively, who absorb blame readily, who will bend toward responsibility even when it doesn't belong to them, they tend to attract or to remain in relationships with people who have learned that this is how conflict resolves itself in this particular dynamic. People who have understood, consciously or not, that disagreement in this relationship does not require negotiation, because the apologizer will eventually absorb it. That tension does not require mutual examination, because the person across from them will take on whatever portion of fault is necessary to make the tension pass.
This is not always deliberate. Sometimes it happens through pure habit, through a dynamic that has simply never been examined or challenged. But the result is a relationship that is deeply unequal in a way that is almost invisible from the outside, one in which one person is perpetually wrong and the other is perpetually right, not because that reflects reality in any meaningful way, but because one person has been conditioned to bend toward blame, and the other has simply never been asked not to let them.
What makes all of this so painful and so important to understand with real compassion is that it is almost entirely invisible from the outside. People who over-apologize often appear, from a social distance, to be perfectly fine. They seem pleasant and warm and considerate and easy to be around. Nobody sees the internal monitoring that is running constantly beneath the surface of every interaction. Nobody sees the self-editing, the bracing, the preemptive guilt that arrives before anything has even happened. Nobody sees the exhaustion of living inside a pattern that requires this much ongoing vigilance just to get through an ordinary day. Because apologizing looks like grace, it looks like emotional maturity, it looks like the kind of social awareness that speaks well of a person's character, when really, in many cases, it is none of those things. It is fear, old, practiced, deeply embedded fear, wearing the costume of politeness and offering itself as a shield against something that, in most of the rooms these people now inhabit, no longer actually poses any threat at all. There is a grief inside this pattern that almost never gets named, and it deserves to be named. People who have spent years apologizing for things that were never their fault often carry a quiet, accumulated grief for all the times they should have stood their ground and didn't. For all the apologies that were accepted without anyone ever pausing to ask, "But wait, did you actually do something wrong?" For all the relationships in which they made themselves progressively smaller and the other person, knowingly or not, simply allowed it to happen. For the version of themselves that existed before the apologizing became so automatic, the version that had edges, that could say clearly and without apology, "No, actually, that one is not on me." That version didn't disappear. It simply went very, very quiet under the weight of years of conditioning. And it is still there, waiting for the moment when it becomes safe enough to speak. The path forward for people carrying this pattern is not about learning to stop apologizing, because genuine apology offered from a place of real accountability is one of the most important and dignified things a person can extend to another. The work is something more precise and in some ways more difficult than simply apologizing less. It is about learning to introduce a pause into the space between the impulse and the word. A small, deliberate moment of genuine inquiry, not asking whether someone could possibly be upset, not searching for any conceivable way in which the situation might be their fault, but simply asking, "Did I actually do something wrong here?" And if the answer is honestly no, letting the apology stay unspoken, not as rigidity, not as punishment, not as a performance of boundaries, but as a quiet act of honesty. Because every time a person apologizes for something that isn't their fault, they confirm to themselves at some level below conscious awareness that they were wrong. And they were not. They were never wrong for existing, never wrong for needing things, never wrong for having edges and opinions and a presence that took up space in the room. They were taught to believe they were, and there is a profound and life-changing difference between those two things. Because people who over-apologize are not weak, and they are not without backbone, and they are not people who simply don't know their own worth. They are people who learned, in the most formative and vulnerable years of their life, that maintaining connection required making themselves the problem, and who have been solving that problem ever since. Long after the environment that created it has ceased to exist. Long after the people who taught them to brace are no longer in the room. They are still apologizing in spaces that are actually safe, still shrinking in rooms that actually have enough space for all of them, still absorbing blame in relationships that would survive, intact and whole, even if they didn't. And somewhere, beneath all of it, beneath all the sorries and the my faults and the I should have known better, there is someone waiting, not for permission to stop apologizing, but for proof, real and repeated and trustworthy proof that they are allowed to be here exactly as they are, without earning it first, without shrinking to deserve it, without apologizing for the simple, irreducible fact of their own presence. That proof is what changes everything. And it begins, slowly, imperfectly, one small moment at a time. The very first time they pause before the sorry and realize, with something that feels almost like relief, this one was never mine to carry.